Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and ever since the launch of the War Within expansion, we've been releasing rogue guides for Season 1, and there are even an updated version of these guides for the patch 11.05, which brought with it quite a number of class changes. While on the channel, the guides have mostly been focused on PvE content, I still do enjoy playing by Outlaw Rogue within PvP specifically. And while the spec didn't really have a really good start at the start of Season 1, ever since 11.05 it has blown up in popularity, performing way above the rest in terms of PvP, whether it is the solo shuffle or BG Blitz Battlegrounds, and the spec is an absolute monster right now. So if you've ever wanted to get into the class of Rogue, especially with the spec of Outlaw, now would be the perfect time to dive right into it, especially with them uncapping, capping, and making it much easier for you to gear out all of your alts. So I wanted to put together a quick PvP guide to get you started playing Outlaw Rogue within the rest of the Season 1 of the War Within expansion. And trust me, this spec is incredibly fun. It's so much more powerful than it's ever has been. As always, if you want to see more War Within guides on the channel, be sure to follow and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. I'm very excited to get back into some Outlaw PvP guides because we've been waiting for a good bit. Ever since expansion launched, the spec didn't really start off on a good foot. But here we are, and it's in a much better spot. So what is new for the class of Rogue that really allows them to shine and be better within Season 1 of War Within? A handful of changes came across this update that I've recorded in the PvE side of guides, but I'll go over this here really quickly. Cut to the chase, basically allows you to remove Slice and Dice off of your bars. You don't have to manage Slice and Dice anymore, so less common points for you to manage, which means a little bit better and easier cognitive load for things you gotta manage within Rogue in PvP. Slice and Dice isn't one of those things. Another ability that got buffed up massively with a very slight adjustments is Feint, which is now off the GCD. Feint, together with talents such as Elusiveness, grants you, or rather Elusiveness over here, grants you a 20% damage reduction, and you can pre-feint a stun, pre-feint a bunch of damage, maintain feint at all times. So this makes you super tanky as long as you have the resources for it. It does mean you'll have to manage feint to make sure you're not spamming it too quickly to be able to, run out of energy or burn up all the charges way too quickly. But because of the cooldown reduction of Outlaw Rogue, you can technically maintain it up at all times, which gives you so many new possibilities of how you play defensively. Double grapple hook with thrill seeking is also really fun. It does mean you no longer have a shadow step kidney or a shadow step interrupt for those quick moment to moment instant movement capabilities against other players, but being able to grapple around a bunch, especially with the fate bound, is insanely fun. So we're trading off the surprise element for much better mobility. Supercharge is another talent that's incredibly good, that's getting a lot of play, but not by everybody, but it has seen some uses in burst situations, especially if you like playing around the ability of Killing Spree within PvP. But what Supercharge does is it gives Roll the Bones an extra mechanic. Roll the Bones is usually how we manage our buffs, and we reroll out our bad buffs, but now it actually makes Roll the Bones a primer ability where we can use Roll the Bones to buff up the damage of our next few finishers, Killing Spree included, which becomes really insane when it comes to the overall damage and gives us an option of what type of talent rows we could spec into, not just going for the vigor and a pointer to lethality at all times. Also, Subterfuge as a passive talent does also extend other stealth elements such as Taken by Surprise, which grants us additional haste for up to 26 seconds, which means that you can have additional extra raw amounts of stats just for diving into a vanish once every so often. From there on though, I do want to take a look at some of the different viable talent options for Outlaw Rogue. They are, for the most part, going to be ambush-based builds, as that has been predominantly the more popular choice that allows you for better consistency, more combo point generation, which means that you don't have to worry about generating resource ever. Technically, there is a playstyle with Keep It Rolling that's kind of starting to maybe open up a little bit more because it works well in Dungeons and Raids, and that translates pretty well, that PvE playstyle, into PvP as well. But for the most part, I'm seeing predominantly most rogues are still playing the Hidden Opportunity ambush builds, which are very comfortable to play with PvP in particular. There are two variations of it. Either this current one, which I'll have the variations of this build in the description section of the video, so if you want to just pull those builds specifically and you want to import them directly into your character window, you can. But the variation of this are going to be either a energy heavy, resource heavy variation with 2 points into vigor and 1 point into lethality, skipping out on Supercharger, which is kind of like the baseline version of Outlaw, especially if you're someone who hates having to manage energy or feel like you're always energy starved as Rogue. This is the best build to start with. However, there is a variation of this build that I've been able to play around with as well, which goes into Supercharger. It does give up Vigor, which is going to be a significant give on your energy and resources, but it does pick up better damage with Supercharger together with Force Induction, which just amplifies the effectiveness of Supercharger. This gives you technically better burst windows, but you are trading out quite a significant bit of energy loss for it. So if you're someone who wants to play a more bursty variation of Rogue, maybe one that's not completely Fadebound, maybe one with Trickster for like a big all-in go, that's a decent variation to work with. But for the most part, if you're just getting into Outlaw, play the 2 points into Vigor and 1 point into Lethality variation. As for the Rogue hero talents, for the most part, most players are picking up Fadebound, and there's multiple reasons as to why. Anytime you spend combo points as Fadebound, you do either additional damage to a target or buffer the damage that you're going to be dealing afterwards, which means it's a very, very nice option. It's very, very passive, as the coin flips are a fantastic bit of just passive damage output. You also do get 4 grapple hooks, because every time with that survival you grapple, you can grapple a second time without the ability going on cooldown, so you can have up to 4 grappling hooks, which gives you insane mobility. Fatebound also, outside of the passive damage, does have some defensive components with Tempted Fate. Basically, a critical strike chance helps reduce some of the damage that you take, which is a nice form of defensive value, and Fatebound for the most part is the preferable option. That being said, don't feel like you need to just spec into Fadebound and stick with it. Trickster is a decent option within PvP. While it doesn't see that much play in dungeons and raids, it actually has some value within PvP, and you're more than welcome to experiment with it. Trickster is also, for the most part, very passive with the Unseen Blade as it procs from your basic combat abilities, also making enemies take more damage from you, but can also reduce the damage you take from them by little. Primary mechanic of the Trickster is to build up the damage of Flawless Form, which can buff up the damage of your finishers from Between the Eyes, Dispatches, but also killing sprees. So if you're a big fan of big bursty killing sprees, Trickster might be for you. Trickster does have some utility too with Don't Be Suspicious, where Blind can actually have a slightly shorter cooldown, and the ability of Sap can have a longer range, which can make it easier for you to land crowd control on enemies. So Trickster has some value. For the most part, it hasn't gotten as popular as Fatebound, but there's a lot of room to experiment within PvP content in particular. Before moving off of the talents, however, let's quickly go over the PvP talents as well. Your mandatory and kind of default PvP choice is Endurance Brawler. You kind of want to put this one in and never change it out. So you have at least one PvP talent slot that you almost never shift out of. And hopefully in the future, Outlaw Rogues will get maybe some kind of a PvP talent refresher, so we actually have a little bit more options. But this one is so good because it buffs up your chances for Sinister Strike to hit a second time in order to allow your pistol shots to be used more regularly because of the whole opportunity mechanic of Outlaw Rogue. This Endurance Brawler not only focuses for pistol shots, but also for ambushes to double hit as well, because hidden opportunity gains all the benefits of double hitting of Sinister Strike, so it just ends up being the best performance-based PvP option that everybody should have. Outside of that, there are a couple of different variations of talents that you can pick up within your slots. There is some flexibility, like Dismantle is a fantastic option when you're fighting against melee classes, so warriors, to some degree, maybe paladins, but not as good for them. Death Knights, other rogues, Dismantle is fantastic against them specifically. Smoke Bomb is a fantastic choice, especially in BG Blitz, because it can help you capture objectives or single out an enemy, or even place a defensive Smoke Bomb on an ally. There's so much viability for Smoke Bomb and so many different uses in big group scenarios, but this one can also really work out well in PvP. If, let's say, you don't have enough crowd control when singling out an enemy, placing a Smoke Bomb on top of him, making it harder for the healer to get the heals into the Smoke Bomb, can also be enough to score kills. Besides this, we also have abilities such as Veil of Midnight, which can give Cloak of Shadows the ability to remove harmful physical effects, great against bleeds like from a Feral Druid or from Assassination Rogue, but also great if you're facing against a lot of melee focused enemies. Then we have talents such as Take Your Cut, which is another good option, where Roll the Bones will grant you additional haste, which means better energy regeneration, faster auto attacks, and overall a decent damage buff not only for you, but to all allies within 15 yards. So it's a nice bit of a group-based gameplay. Outside of that, though, the rest of the PvP talents have some very, very niche value, very, very niche uses. There may be some opportunity for like Thick as Thieves to work with Tricks of Trade in a coordinator group, or maybe Dagger in the Dark if you just want to be roaming out in the open world. But for the most part, all of them have very, very niche, unique uses, but the ones that we did mention, those are probably the most universally praised ones that are used just about all forms of PvP content. Next, I want to go over how to gear your rogue for PvP, which is fairly straightforward. You PvP, acquiring honor, or better yet conquest that is now uncapped, and buy gear on PvP vendors. There is also some crafting you can do in order to better optimize for your stats, but for the most part, you are going to be using agility gear from PvP vendors, which is pretty easy to get. It's literally on all of the gear. What you want to watch out for, however, is the secondary stats. Versatility is going to be our best secondary stat. It'll give us protection and more damage, and it's like the only stat that we can really utilize to deal additional damage. From there, we get haste up to 15% maximum from gear, and mostly from trinkets, as well as from rings and neck slots too. So you won't really need too much haste on your pieces, just 15% within PvP minimum. From there on, you can either put points into critical strike, which can give us more damage with between the eyes, but also between the eyes can crit more often. So, and if it does crit, it does more damage. So some crit scaling, but not crazy, since crit is pretty devalued in PvP. Mastery technically is okay as a stat too, not amazing, but if you are good at playing all three specs of rogues, then mastery versatility will be your best stats for Outlaw Rogue if you're looking to play assassination and subtlety. And while it may not be the best and the most optimal stat for Outlaw, technically it is better if you're looking to play all three specs at the same time. When it comes to PvP trinkets in particular, for the most part, we are running the Forged Medallion, which is going to be the way that we'll be breaking out of CC. But for our damage trinket, most rogues opt in for Insignia of Alacrity. It grants us additional haste, which helps our reach our haste cap of 50%, but also because Outlaw Rogue does damage at all times, not just in burst windows. We don't necessarily need to pair ourselves with a burst trinket. Having a trinket that has a decent bit of optimum of overall stats, especially during our sustain windows, is generally the preference, which is why we're going with the Insignia. Now, when you're trying to optimize your rogue a little bit better, you can swap out a couple of pieces with PvP gear and even apply some embellishments. Right now, none of the embellishments are really all that strong within the Season 1 of War Within, not like they were in the season for Dragonflight, but they still can help you inch out a little bit more damage. And right now, based on the data that we have, majority of players just usually make belts or boots or any other items that don't necessarily have the stats they're looking for, maybe to reach a certain amount of haste, or maybe just get themselves more versatility or mastery if they're trying to, let's say, optimize the gear on the conquest vendor. When people do create embellished items, they usually put elemental focusing lens on it, which simply just allows your abilities or your attacks to deal additional bonus magic damage based on the gems that you have in your gear. It's not an incredible amount of additional damage, it's just a passive little bit of extra, but like I said, none of the other embellishments are really all that strong, and so this is why elemental focusing lens, being just a flat damage option, seems to be the one the players are focusing on if they are making any embellishments for their gear. And as we're going over the gear, we might as well go over the enchants very quickly. For your weapon, for the most part, you want to take the enchant of Authority of the Depths for both of your weapons, which provides you with additional shatter damage to a singular target. For your cloak, as well as bracers and boots, you'll mostly go with enchants that provide you with additional speed. Leech and avoidance are not amazing for PvP as a stat, but speed can help you quickly close the gap with a target or escape a target, which can be actually pretty good when it comes to keeping up a greater offense or even creating some defense for your character. So speed will go with our cloaks, bracers, and boots. For our chest piece, we'll go with a crystalline radiance for additional stats. For our pants, we'll go with a stormbound armor kit, and for our ring enchant, we'll go with radiant versatility or cursed versatility if you feel like you have a little bit too much haste on your gear. From there, I want to talk about the playstyle and the rotation of the Outlaw Rogue within PvP combat. For the most part, if you played the spec in dungeons or raids, a lot of those lessons from PvE translate pretty well in PvP. However, you don't really get to utilize crowd control as aggressively within dungeons and raids, but you will be utilizing it in PvP a lot better. But for the most part, PvE teaches us how to build and spend calm points as efficiently as possible, and those rules still apply within PvP combat. First, I want to go over some of the different generators for calm points. Starting in stealth, you either have a stealth window or you have an out of stealth window. In stealth, our two primary calm point generators that are unique to stealth are going to be cheap shot, which is an ability that allows us to crowd control an enemy for a handful of seconds while building a single calm point, or ambush, which generates 3 calm points. So it will be the highest priority calm point builder for the spec of Outlaw Rogue, which we can use in stealth during burst windows, but also out of stealth with a spec talent of Audacity. Or procs of pistol shot allow you to sometimes gain the ability to use ambush outside of stealth, and the way that you'll be able to do so, it actually replaces your sinister strike with an ambush, so you don't necessarily need to have a new ability on your bars in order to enable that free ambush. you just replace your Sinister Strike with that ambush. As for all of the different combo point builders outside of stealth, we have the ability of Sinister Strike, and we talked about it kind of a little bit already. It's a very, very basic combo point builder that just generates a single combo point. It also has a small chance to make your next pistol shot cost less and give more damage. Besides being a very basic combo point builder, Sinister Strike can also build you additional combo points with Count the Odds, where Ambush, Sinister Strike, and Dispatch, one of your base finishers, all have a chance to grant you more Roll the Bones. That'll come into play once we talk about the Roll the Bones mechanic in a little bit here, but it is something to note. Sinister Strike and, I guess, Ambush to some degree are both very, very great base combat abilities. Pistol Shot as an ability on its own isn't really ever worth casting. It generates you one combo point without any procs, but when it does get the opportunity to proc, it is worth pressing and becomes a higher priority finisher than Sinister Strike. So if you wanted to create a priority for your finishers, Ambush would be at the top, then Pistol Shot with procs would be second, and then Sinister Strike would be a very rare bottom. Pistol Shots could also actually bank up multiple charges of opportunity procs thanks to the talent of Fan the Hammer. When Sinister Strike, or I guess Ambush as well, strikes at additional time, you gain additional stacks of opportunity, allowing you to bank up all of those stacks. And when you do use a Pistol Shot, it'll actually use multiple stacks every time you use it, which does mean that when generating combo points, you can actually bank up and generate multiple stacks of opportunity and then unleash them all at once. So you don't necessarily just spend opportunity procs instantly if you feel like you could spend those combo points a little bit better. And because of the talent of Hidden Opportunity, Sinister Strike effects, which is usually how you proc those procs of Pistol Shot, also apply to Ambush. So sometimes you will ambush, get a proc of free Pistol Shot, get a proc of Ambush, and you'll build an incredible amount of combo points like this, and that's very, very common. So this means that you're building a ton of combo points, so combo point management and using them effectively for your finishers ends up being very, very important to Outlaw because the spec can build an insane amount of combo points in a single global. So now we know how to build combo points, but now we gotta learn how to spend them appropriately. And because of the talent of Ruthlessness, we want to spend at the very bare minimum at least 5 combo points on finishers. So once you reach 5, but in most cases you'll reach 6 or 7 quite easily with just how fast Outlaw generates combo points. Once you have at least 5 combo points, this is where you want to start investing them into finishers. One of the basic finishers will be Kidney Shot, which will be how you'll be locking down the target in a stun for at least 5 seconds. We generally use Kidney Shot on our kill target, but you could also use it on the CC target, like if let's say you want to crowd control a healer and then lock down a DPS to make sure they're not getting any healing or any cooldowns. There's a lot of uses for Kidney Shot, but in most cases you'll use it on our priority kill target when we're trying to stun them, lock them in place, prevent them from using defenses in order to land a kill. Then we have Between the Eyes, which is another finisher once you hit 5 combo points, and when you don't need to lock down on any mini Kidney Shot, Between the Eyes is something you want to maintain, but also it'll be a primary usage finisher for burst damage. Between the Eyes does quite a bit of damage, even more damage if it lands a crit, which is why we have some crit scaling on the spec, but also grants us a buff of Between the Eyes, increasing our critical strike chance by 20%, which allows us to reach fairly high consistent crit chances, increasing our overall damage. Between the Eyes also becomes a priority finisher when we're using burst abilities, thanks to the talent of Crack Shot. We'll be using stealth states primarily through the ability of Vanish to enter a stealth mode, which allows us to spam Between the Eyes as our primary finisher. Using the ability of Between the Eyes also has a chance for it to refund back the combo points that it just spent, so it is not unlikely for you to be able to chain multiple uses of Between the Eyes back to back against the target with a bit of RNG. That's kind of where a lot of the burst damage can come from the spec of Outlaw Rogue. When Between the Eyes is not available and we're not able to lock down a target in a Kidney Shot, we primarily spend all those combo points into the ability of Dispatch, which is a very basic combo point spender. Next, I want to talk about the ability of Roll the Bones, which is a pretty decent component around the Outlaw Rogue base playstyle. With Roll the Bones, we get to roll a random assortment of buffs, and out of 6 buffs, we can either get a 1 buff combo, a 2 buff combo, or a 5 buff combo. And there's a variety of different buffs, from a crit buff called Lucius Precision, that's a high quality buff. We have Broadside, which looks like a cannibal icon that grants our combo point builders an extra combo point that they can build and they do damage. Also another high priority buff. Then there's True Bearing that gives us better cooldown reduction. As we spend combo points into finishers, it helps shave off the cooldown of many of our basic abilities. also a high priority buff, and every other buff technically can be useful in some situations, but they all fall under the category of a low priority buff, and that's the only thing you really need to know about Outlaw when it comes to PvP content: high priority and low priority buffs. In most cases, Outlaw Rogue, we want to try to maintain a high priority buff as best as possible with Roll the Bones, but when we do get low priority buffs, we want to roll out of them as soon as the ability of Roll the Bones is back up and available. However, even if you get a low priority buff, we do generate additional buffs with Count the Odds, which becomes very important inside of our burst windows. In most cases, when we're bursting, we're using abilities like Ambush, Sinister Strikes, and Dispatches during our burst, which all have a chance to roll random buffs that you don't already have. So even if you end up rolling into a bad buff, just a basic combat gameplay, there's a good chance you'll roll other buffs on top of it. So this kind of makes the whole Roll the Bones mechanic a lot less bad to play with. You still want to manage your buffs to make sure you have another set of buffs available, but during your big burst windows, for instance, there's a good chance that you're going to be able to get a bunch of buffs as you're bursting. So it makes that playstyle just a little bit better and a little bit less annoying to play with. There's still a little bit of RNG when it comes to playing Outlaw. That's nothing you're going to be able to escape of, but being able to roll the bones as you play aggressively, as you build comp points and spend them, does make it a little bit more manageable in a process. And the best part is, Roll the Bones has a general basic set of rules that you'll usually work on and follow in terms of when do you want to reroll, when do you not want to reroll. So when you press Roll the Bones and when you roll at least one high value buff, you'll want to keep it. Even if it's just like part of a combination of a good buff and a bad buff, if it has at least one high value buff, you want to keep it for as long as possible and not reroll out of it. If you get a low priority buff, then you want to reroll out of it as soon as possible. If you're playing with a talent of Supercharger variant of Outlaw Rogue, then you can actually use Roll the Bones as a primer for big damage. Even if you roll a bad low priority buff, it still buffs your next two finishers, so it lets you set up a big killing spree or a big maybe vanish crack shot between window to get a lot of damage out on the target. So that can be really fun if you don't enjoy the RNG of Roll the Bones but still would want to be able to do something every time you roll it, which is really fun to play into. Another mechanic that you want to pay attention to is loaded dice. Whenever you use your big buff of Adrenaline Rush, which we'll talk about in a second, it grants us ability to at least roll 2 buffs with our Roll the Bones. So whenever you do have loaded dice active, this is an opportunity for you to, let's say you rolled into a bad buff, you want to replace it with a higher chance to get 2 good buffs, use Adrenaline Rush, get loaded dice, and then roll into a guaranteed 2 buffs. And there's a pretty good chance when you do so, you're probably going to get at least 1 higher priority buffs, which you got Troop Bearing here at the compass icon. So I'm going to keep that as long as possible inside of my big burst window with one big ability. Speaking of burst, let's talk about Outlaw Rogue and some of the bigger cooldowns. One of the mechanics you should know about Outlaw Rogue is Restless Blades. As you spend comp points into finishes, we get to reduce the variety of different cooldowns for your Outlaw Rogue within PvP. Things like Adrenaline Rush, Between the Eyes, Blade Flurry, Blade Rush, Ghosted Strike, Grapple Hook, Keep It Rolling, Killing Spree, Roll the Bones, Sprint, and Vanish. So a lot of our cooldowns are going to be sometimes high CD, but it's actually deceptively too high. Like one of our big cooldowns we'll talk about here in a second, which is Adrenaline Rush. Technically it's a 3-minute cooldown, but in actual day-to-day gameplay, it feels like a 1.5 minute cooldown, maybe 2 at the longest. So that is something that we'll want to play around with Outlaw, is try to use the cooldowns aggressively as the spec. We don't necessarily need to hold them back for key moments like the other specs of rogues and other classes. We kind of want to send them as soon as possible. One of those big abilities is going to be Adrenaline Rush, which is a big button for big burst. It grants you a bunch of resources from additional energy to additional comp points with improved version of Adrenaline Rush. It also gives our better attack speed and can play around with the cooldown reduction element of the spec, which gives us a ton of burst window, and we kind of want to use Adrenaline Rush pretty regularly. We don't necessarily want to hold it back like Assassination Rogue's Death Mark or a Subtlety Rogue's Shadow Blades. We want to use it as soon as possible, as aggressively as possible throughout a match. Another ability that's fantastic offensively and defensively is Vanish. Obviously has some uses to be able to disappear from sight of a target, but because Outlaw plays around the talent of Crackshot, we will use Vanish aggressively. Because of the cooldown reduction, we also get charges of Vanish back very quickly. So at the very least, if you want to just hold 1 charge for defense, 1 charge for offense as Outlaw, that's a perfectly reasonable way of going about it, but we will be using Vanishes aggressively to deal damage as the spec. Another cooldown that's worth noting is Blade Flurry, which basically allows our single target abilities to cleave enemies around us, which allows us to just deal additional damage to enemies that are fully stacked together. This is amazing in big fights within BGA Blitz if you're looking to put pressure on a bunch of targets while having a high target focus, and also can be very useful in 2s and 3s and solos in general, or even out in the open world if you're fighting multiple enemies. We don't have a lot of ways to deal AoE damage to get stealthies out of stealth either, but Blade Rush does deal instant AoE damage when looking for other stealthies, so that can be useful when it comes to finding key targets. Another cooldown worth noting is Ghost Strike, which is actually a column point builder. It just builds one column point, has a fairly long cooldown of 1.5 minutes, but it's actually shorter, and what it does is it places a debuff on the target, causes them to take 15% more damage from our abilities for a few seconds. We basically want to use this ability fairly regularly as part of a burst window, like when you're focusing a target down, lock him down in kill shot, you want to apply a Ghost Strike on them. Ghost Strike as an ability is also off GCD, but it will be necessary when it comes to trying to combine burst in order to take down an enemy target. Another cooldown we're talking about is Killing Spree, also on a 1.5 minute cooldown. This one I use for any kind of content, for any kind of combat whenever I can within PvP. It is excellent as a finisher. It does a bunch of damage, it's been buffed up by quite a bit. It can also free you out of roots, which can be incredibly good and allows you to chase the target even if you're hit by some real big slows. You also, while Killing Spree, don't take any damage, but any damage taken while Killing Spree was active will then be dealt to you slowly over time over 8 seconds. So in a way it can be used defensively, but for the most part we want to use it offensively. I do try to separate Killing Spree away from my crack shot windows, however. So I'll have like a vanish window with big between the eyes, but then I'll use Killing Spree whenever I'm not in a stealth window. So try to separate the two, don't combine them together because it's very important to get as many between the eyes during crack shot, but Killing Spree you can use outside of crack shot anytime you want to, and it pairs really well together with the talents like Supercharger. As for the burst damage of Outlaw Rogue, for the most part you want to get yourself a decent set of buffs and then land a kidney shot or a cheap shot on a target. Killing Spree outside of Vanish or a spam between the eyes inside of Vanish. And one of the better ways to get a proper opener as an Outlaw Rogue, while we don't really have a proper stealth opener like some of the other classes, we can do a decent bit of damage from the get-go by opening up with stealth, going for Adrenaline Rush to build comp points and activate the buff while in stealth, use Roll the Bones to make sure that you have a buff set locked in before you even go, then Cheap Shot, Ghost Strike into the target, and then you'll build in comp points and spending as many between the eyes into the target as possible. After that stealth window is over, maybe you could follow up with a Killing Spree, but it does give us at least an opener to at least put some pressure into the target, and Outlaw Rogue does have quite a significant bit of burst. We just have not as high burst as some of the other specs out there, but we make up for it with great sustained damage outside of those burst cooldowns, but it doesn't mean that our burst does not have a bite behind it. Also, as a rogue when it comes to PvP, knowing how to play defensively is also very important. Rogues have a variety of different talents to work with defensively, but one of the best defenses we have access to is just the ability to run away. Double or even quad, a grapple hook is incredibly good. So if you're just gonna hit, your healer's locked down, they can't heal you, running away from an enemy target and just disappearing is not the worst option. If you can't run away, that's a good idea to use cooldowns, usually evasion against physical damage or cloak of shadows against magic damage. Because of the way that feint works right now, with it being off DCD, if you're running the talent of elusiveness instead of cheat death, you can use feint as an extra defensive layer in order to help survive some of the damage you take. Also, crack control an enemy target is perfectly reasonable too. Whether you want to stun them, which usually you want to save those for kill targets, but if you don't want to stun them, dismantle against a melee target to take the weapons away can be very helpful. Or using even a gouge and I guess the caster in order to stop them from casting into your face, that could also be very helpful. Then we have a little healer, Crimson Vial. It doesn't do a lot of healing, but hey, anything works at this point, right? When you're just locked down, there's not much you can really do. Getting some kind of a heal is better than no heal, so don't forget that Crimson Vial is an ability that you can utilize. But besides that, that's going to be all of the basics I can tell you when it comes to playing your Outlaw Rogue within Season 1 of War Within. This spec is incredibly fun, but does have a lot of things going for it at the same time. If anything, focusing on offensive damage and pressure and using mobility to escape danger is usually the play. We're not really a bursty class, so you don't necessarily want to disengage as an Outlaw Rogue as often as you would as Assassination or even a Subtlety. You kind of want to stay in combat as best as you can, because the longer you can stay in combat, the faster you can get a lot of your cooldown, so you are punished for disengaging too much and playing like a rogue. Think of yourself more like a fury warrior with a lot of crowd control and a lot of stealthy elements in a way. And that's probably the best way to approach Outlaw Rogue in day-to-day PvP situations. But as always, I do want to thank you guys so much for watching this guide video, and I do hope you did enjoy it. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like. I would very, very much appreciate it. Join our Discord community if you got any more questions regarding Rogue PvP, or if you want to get some of the guides, like PvE guides specifically, but also some of the mount guides. I've been starting to put up more guides on the channel there too, so it's probably the best place to get some of those written versions of the guides there directly. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Are you playing Outlaw Rogue, and are you picking it up for the rest of the Season 1 of War Within? And I'll see all of you guys in the next one.